Good afternoon. We're here with Umair Haque. Among other things, you're a columnist for the Harvard Business Review. You guys gave an inspiring lecture about the entire new way we need to do business in this world. Could you give a very short summary of what your vision is about doing business in the 21st century?
Sure. So who am I? I'm the director of the Havas Media Lab. I have a blog at harvardbusiness.org. You know, my vision is about capitalism, and I think what we're seeing today in this kind of great crisis that struck the world is the need for a very different kind of capitalism. And the way that we kind of summarize that at the lab is to say that the ideals which capitalism 1.0 was built on are now obsolete. They're ideals that were built for assembly lines, and what we need to do is build a better kind of capitalism on a set of ideals that were built for people. Because ideals are what ultimately influence the ways that we organize and the ways that we strategize. So without better ideals, we're going to be kind of locked into the behavior that's led to this crisis.
Okay, and one of the things you said is the equation is what makes profit for me, but fucks up the rest. Yeah, it's Holland. We can say the F word here. Pretty much. Is always smaller than if it makes profit for me and it makes profit for you as a client.
Sure. I think what's different about what what we call constructive capitalism, and I think it's a kind of capitalism that many firms are embracing now, is that it creates a better kind of value. And a better kind of value is one that's authentic, right? It's value that flows to people and communities and society, and that's what we call thick value, not thin value. Thin value is value where my benefits are counterbalanced by your losses. And the problem with thin value is that it crashes very easily, right? And what we've seen in this crisis is that when we create thin value, you know, a year later or 5 years later, like the banks were doing, it can kind of crumble and collapse very, very easily. So thick value is resistant to that kind of compression, and that's what makes it strategically important. What makes it economically important is that it's real value, right? It's authentic value. It's not value that is being given with one hand and we're secretly taking away with the other.
Okay. So how do you feel about, it's in Holland we've got an English term actually called greenwashing. I don't know if you heard about it.
Yeah.
So we're not really changing our business, we're just putting some environmentally friendly or that's not the way we're going. Are those companies going to be seeing themselves?
Yes. So I think greenwashing gets to the heart of this great debate that we're having about capitalism. And I think, you know, what greenwashing says is there's some firms that still see moving towards thick value, more sustainable business models as a cost, and so they greenwash. What today's real revolutionaries are realizing is that it's not a cost; it's a benefit. So the companies that I discussed today, whether it's Google or Nike or Apple or Walmart or Threadless, they're not rebuilding business in a better way because it's a cost. They're doing it because it's more profitable. It's more beneficial. They realize a bigger and stronger advantage from doing so. And so greenwashing is trying to, you know, hide yesterday because we still see tomorrow as profitable. I think the reality is that when we make the shift, we don't have to greenwash because we're too busy learning how to be profitable anyways.
So I was one of the things which really inspired me in your presentation was you had some examples there of companies which you said, listen, we're in the biggest crisis in well, decades, and here we've got these companies who are actually doing the right thing, who are actually you know, being considered as, well, maybe soft or something, and look at their stock prices, they're still, you know, the rest is crashing and they're still there.
Look, I think that's, you know, that's what we miss in this debate, right? So what we've seen is that when we follow destructive ideals, destructive in an economically destructive way, obviously the value we create blows up at the end of the day. What we've explored less is, does following new ideals, more constructive ideals, ideals of, you know, renewal and democracy and peace, is that stuff more profitable? The interesting thing is that when we look at it, it is. And the market is starting to recognize it. That the value that those companies are creating is better value, it's stronger value. And it's a better kind of business. So when I say better kind of business, you know, it is better ethically, it is better morally. But it is better ethically and morally because it's better economically first.
Okay. One of the other interesting slides you had was you showed a relationship between GDP and wealth creation and the growth in it.
Yeah.
And what really surprised me, because they're not known for their environmentally friendly policy, is that China still creates more wealth than GDP, even though they create a lot of environmentally unfriendly products.
So that's a really good point. I think that so that study is factoring in different kinds of costs, and I think that one was more concerned with social cost than environmental cost. And you're absolutely right. In fact, when we think about the environmental cost of China, the latest estimate is that it's going to cost 6% of GDP, right? So it's a huge amount of wealth that it's going to consume. And so, the point of that slide was to say that incomes are very different from wealth, and they're very different from outcomes. And what we're measuring may not be that meaningful in the first place, right? If we're only looking at incomes. And the question now is, how do we measure that stuff in a better way? Should we add the environmental cost back? Should we add the social cost back? Should we add both?
Okay, just to make a leap to maybe something completely different, because you gave a lot of examples of big corporations, big companies, which are doing, which are making the steps to being a real value creation. If I'd make the statement that it would be easier for smaller companies to do so, and with the talent being, the real talent being very thinking this is very important. I assume you agree with the rest of the speakers that talent wants real creation. Do you think smaller companies will grow in the future? And I mean, in Holland, for example, 50% of our labor force is working for the multinationals, 50% is working for the smaller companies, while smaller companies do have 90% of the total number of companies. Do you think that's going to shift? Do you think we'll have a relative bigger percentage of smaller institutions because of this?
So look, absolutely, many of these ideals have been pioneered by small companies, and the reason that I talk about big companies more in presentations like this is because they're the companies that we're the most familiar with, and it's often very challenging to us to see that even the biggest companies in the world are shifting in ways that we didn't think about and we didn't anticipate. Now, will smaller companies dominate? Absolutely, yeah. I think, look, this is about what I call asymmetrical competition. And what we see is it happens across industries. So, yesterday media was dominated by 5 big companies, right? Today there's a handful of small companies that are challenging for the domination of different kinds of media markets. And, that's the best story of asymmetrical competition happened in media. And that's Google, right? Which came from nowhere 10 years ago to being one of the leading companies in the world today. Another great story of asymmetrical competition is Apple, right? So 10 years ago, Apple was a very small and very broke company. And today it's reached a point of huge dominance. Now what's interesting about Google and Apple is that they exert this kind of global reach and this kind of global dominance without necessarily being as big companies yesterday, right? So they're smaller big companies, if you like.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that's a very important distinction that you have to draw. Whereas yesterday's big companies were like, 100,000 people and more. Google is never going to be a company of 100,000 people. Apple is never going to be a company of 100,000 people.
Okay, that's interesting. And you think that's a trend that will continue? That will
absolutely
eventually the new Google, Facebook might be the new
absolutely.
Google.
I think fundamentally one of the points of having a networked world is that they reduce all of the costs that made it economical for us to aggregate into these big companies in the first place, right? So if I can very easily sort of, find a great product designer and a great marketer and a great distributor, we don't all need to be part of the same company anymore, right? We can interact very easily with each other over the networks, over the web, over the mobile, whatever.
Okay. Thank you. It was very inspiring.
Thank you.